Okay, good morning. Thank you for coming out this morning. My name is Evan Weiner, and my job has been in the past as a journalist, and I've been doing this kind of thing since I'm about 15 years old, although there will be some people who would argue with me, like Mrs. Prinzi, who was the music teacher in fourth grade, saying that you would start doing this in fourth grade. So anyway. We're talking about the War of 1812, a war that very few people know about. Very few historians look back on because nothing happened during the war except the White House was burnt down during the War of 1812. And that's a license plate from Maryland, and it says Star-Spangled Banner 200.org because we ended up with the national anthem thanks to the War of 1812. So who won the War of 1812? That's a trick question. Was it Canada? Was it the United States? Was it Britain? The roots start in Quebec City back in 1759. The American Revolution arguably begins on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. So there is Andrew Jackson up there, the Redcoats, and this is the most fierce battle of the War of 1812, except it meant nothing because the war was over. But the Americans won the fiercest battle of the War of 1812 after the war was settled. It is June of 1812. The United States declared war against Great Britain in reaction to three issues. The British economic blockade of France, the kidnapping of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support for hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes. The 36-year-old United States declared war for a second time against Great Britain, and the plan was this. We want all that land in the north, and we want really all the land in the United States up until where Mexico owned the land, which now is California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Texas. We want all the land to the Spanish line. It never happened. A faction of the U.S. Congress made up of mostly Western and Southern congressmen called the Warhawks had been advocating for the declaration of war for several years. Americans like Thomas Jefferson, well, he was president of the United States, thought that the British North American colonists would greet them with open arms. They didn't, particularly the people in Ontario who had no love for the Americans, and Quebecois, no love for the Americans. White House goes up in flames on August 24th, 1814. It's burnt. The White House is burnt, but it's in retaliation. The Federalists, especially New Englanders, who relied heavily with Britain, accused the Warhawks or the war advocates of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda. There are 5 New England states at that point. There are 6 today, but there are 5. Maine and Massachusetts were one state. So it was Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And they were thinking about, hey, this United States, we don't particularly like what it stands for right now. Maybe we should form our own country. Well, that never happened, but there was some support for New England to break away from the United States, form their own country. Most of the wars fought along the Great Lakes. This is Mackinac Island, and I was there in September of 2017. It's one Saturday morning, and we're there watching the reenactment. We're watching the reenactment of the battle at Mackinac Island in 1812, and this wasn't a battle really. What it was the English just took over the fort without any resistance. The general or the guy who was running the fort said, "We surrender," and that was that. No bloodshed. But Mackinac Island, and this is one of the theaters of the War of 1812. In the months following the U.S. declaration of war, American forces launched a 3-point invasion of British North America or Canada, all of which were repulsed. At sea, the United States was far more successful. The USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of victories over British warships. In 1813, the Americans get into Ontario, and they win several key victories in the Great Lakes region, but Britain regains control of the sea and blockades the eastern seaboard. That would be from Massachusetts down to Georgia, because that's what America was in those days. On April 27, 1813, American troops attack York. York is now Toronto, and occupy the town for several days, and they burn down the Palace of Government, the meeting place of the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada. And the Brits don't forget that. They don't forget that at all. They're led by this guy. This guy is Major General Robert Ross, who has no role in American history as far as American history books are concerned. But he is the British general who burns down the White House. And Ross comes over to North America in the summer of 1814, and he is the guy who orders Washington burnt down. And the target is this, the White House. On August 24th, 1814, Washington, D.C. fell to the British. In Washington, British troops burned down the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for the earlier burning of government buildings in Ontario. It wasn't called Ontario in those days, it was still Quebec in those days, West Canada, by U.S. soldiers in 1813. It was called the President's House, not the White House, and it was totally destroyed by the fires. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, tried to save whatever she could, getting out of the White House, including a portrait of George Washington, but the Madisons never returned to the White House, had to be repaired. Then Ross goes up the Baltimore-Washington Expressway. Wait a second, there was no expressway in those days. But they go up and they go into Baltimore, and he's 40 years old now. And they end up at this place, Fort William McHenry. And that's a 15-star flag that flies over Fort William McHenry. And the British bomb it all night, bomb after bomb after bomb after bomb after bomb, but the flag is still there. Sounds like a good song, doesn't it? Sounds just like a good song. I wonder if anybody was there writing down what was going on. Well, the British would retreat. Fort William McHenry withstood a massive British bombardment, and there was a guy there, Francis Scott Key. And he gets his quill pen and his parchment paper and starts writing, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" Hey, I think I got something here. I think I got something. He does write a poem called The Star-Spangled Banner, which, ironically, the tune to the song is an old British drunken tavern song. So they took that from the Brits as part of the national anthem. Oh, say, can you see? It's September 11th, 1814, and the tide of the war turned when an American naval force under Thomas MacDonald won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York at Lake Placid, or on Lake Champlain. Placid's nearby too. Have you ever gone to Lake Champlain? Oh, it's a nice place, right on the Vermont-New York border, and actually the Montreal people from Quebec used to come down there and used to swim there and shop in Plattsburgh. They're not doing that right now. A large army under Sir George Prevost was thus forced to abandon its invasion of the U.S. northeast and retreated to British North America or Canada or to the Montreal area. This is a statue of Albert Gallatin, and in 1814, on Christmas Eve, he finalized negotiations with the Brits to end the War of 1812. And it's back to the 1812 borders. Nobody gains any land. Britain gives up American land near the border and the Great Lakes. U.S. gives up Ontario, and hey, Spain, take Florida from us again. Like in 1783, you can have Florida. It's all yours. It's all yours. Malaria and all, it's all yours. And so Spain gets it, and then the United States gets it back in 1819. President James Madison signs the agreement on September 17, 1815. But nobody told this guy that war is over. Andrew Jackson, General Andrew Jackson. And Old Hickory said we could take it by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British forces were not informed of the end of hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi. On January 8th, 1815, war is over. War is over, but nobody told these guys war is over. A large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular event and victory of the war. Well, it was all in vain, except for this guy. I don't know if you remember him, but in 1959, Johnny Horton had a song called The Battle of New Orleans. In 1814, we took a little trip. Remember that song? Went right to the top. His next song was North to Alaska, and then he died. But he had 2 hit songs right before he passed away. And this is Jackson Square in New Orleans, Louisiana, and here's good old Andrew on his horse, and war is over. So who won this war? Well, this is a cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was part of Britain at that point. And it asks the question, why aren't we Americans? There's no answer. There's no real answer other than this. We are not Americans because of the service of men, like the sailors and soldiers, casualties of the War of 1812, buried in this historic burying ground. They fought and died at sea and ashore to prevent the United States invasion and annexation of our country. Oh, that sounds familiar. But what country are they talking about? There was no Canada. It was Britain. Now, about 17 years ago, I was up in Ottawa, and I was there on business, and we got a tour of Ottawa, the capital. And my son and I brought my son with me at that time. He was 23 years old, and he figured, hey, I'll get a free trip. Don't have to pay for it, hang out. So anyway, he goes with me, and we get this tour. And we're passing the American Embassy. And the woman said, well, we are proud Canadians because of what happened in the War of 1812. We won the war. Well, my son said, how could you have won the war when you weren't a country? They weren't. Well, the Americans never invaded again. Well, that much is almost true. Almost true. But this doesn't give you the answer. War of 1812, this is actually an exhibit in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And just a little exhibit, and there's a Native American or First Nation member in the middle of that, and there were losers here. The 1812 to 1815 was the end, the war, maybe. It probably was the final act of actions that started in Quebec and Nova Scotia some 55 years earlier. Anybody remember Evangeline? The poem. Oh, yes, you do, because you all read it in school. You read it in elementary school. It is your introduction to Canada, so to speak. Evangeline, A Tale of the Acadian, a poem written by American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that was published in 1847. Actually, he didn't even want to do it at first because he didn't know about it. It was a padre in his town in Maine who was working on this, and basically he said, hey, Henry, I don't want to do this anymore. You're good with words. How about you doing it? And he does, and he does the research and all, and it ends up becoming Evangeline. The poem follows an Acadian girl by the name of Evangeline in the search for her lost Gabriel, set during the time of the expulsion of the Acadians. The expulsion of the Acadians was really ethnic cleansing of the French in Nova Scotia. The expulsion of Acadians was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, and also part of Massachusetts back then. It was an area known as Acadia. There is Acadia National Forest now in Maine. The expulsion took place between 1755 and 1764, and it occurred during the French and Indian War, a war started by George Washington when he was an English soldier. He was actually a lieutenant colonel. In all, of the 14,100 Acadians in the region, 11,500 were deported or were killed. This was the largest fort in North America at one time, Louisbourg. It's now a tourist attraction. It's a quarter of its size. It was built in 1730. It was sacked in 1758 by the British. During the 7 Years' War in 1759, the British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. And Montcalm was the guy who defended Quebec City, and it says here, defeated here, received his mortal wounds, 13 September 1759. And this is what happened. This is Quebec City. Anybody been to Quebec City? It is a lovely city. It is a great city to visit. It's also the only stone-walled city in North America, north of Mexico, and you can see all of these stone walls, and they go up to a certain point around there where there's a cliff. And the French felt that they didn't need to extend those walls because nobody in their right mind was going to go over that cliff and to the upper village where all the rich people lived and massacre the rich people. Down here they didn't worry about the people so much. But anyway, the Brits did. They did climb up there. The city was defended by the French general, Marquis de Montcalm. It was a very short battle, 15 minutes. The British got over the cliffs, got onto Abraham's farm, now called the Plains of Abraham. 15-minute fight, British win and surrender Quebec. And there's the Plains of Abraham, there's the Chateau Frontenac. And had history been different, we might be all speaking French right now. We might be speaking French. French didn't have enough people to defend the area. And if you look down, you can see the size of the cliffs, even if you look the other way where St. Foy is. And it's a pretty steep cliff that they had to climb up, but the British did, and basically that was that. The British and French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France from the map completely. Basically, there was a fight over the beaver trade and the fox trade because the furs made great, great coats in Europe, and both countries wanted it. And that's basically where fur trade fights. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1859. Quebec City was permanently lost by the French. 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada. In Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestant Britain. And they're watching closely in the South. What's the South in those days? Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, all separated by a river, and out to, that's basically it, out to Pennsylvania. They know England has won in Quebec, and they've chased the French from Nova Scotia. England pulls its best troops. And of course, it's all taxation without representation. Hey, you gave Barbados representation in 1652. How about us? Nope, nope, nope. And this is Boston. And if you go off Atlantic Street on one of these side streets, you go to basically this little restaurant, and they have 2 boats at the end there. And if you want to go throw tea into the water, pay you $10 and you throw your tea bags in. Although if you go to Atlantic Street, you can do it for nothing. The Quebec Act, passed in 1774, allowed the Canadian or the Quebecois to have religious and linguistic freedoms, to openly practice their Catholicism and use their French. Those Canadians were therefore not unhappy enough with British rule to choose to participate in the American Revolution. Well, the Quebecois hated, absolutely hated, people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and a whole bunch of others. They thought they were godless and heathenists, and they'd rather stick with the devil they knew, the Brits, than those guys. So they decided to stay on the sides of the Brits. The American Revolution, 1775 to 83, arose from growing tensions between residents of Great Britain's 13 northern southern colonies and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown, while the Quebecers were going to stay with Britain. Nova Scotia, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. Skirmishes between British troops and the colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in April 1975 kicked off the armed conflict, and by the following summer the rebels were waging a full-scale war for independence. France entered the American Revolution on the side of the colonists in 1778, turning what had essentially been a civil war into an international conflict. And you know what? Most of the colonists didn't care. Slaves, didn't matter to them. They were slaves. Women, didn't matter to them because they had no rights. Literally had no rights. Didn't matter if it was the new government or the old government. The Native Americans, First Nation, didn't matter to them. Talking maybe about 2% of the population that wanted to get rid of King George III. You know, I told them they better fix that bell in Philadelphia. It's cracked. It's cracked. You can't use it. You can't use it at all. But they never listened to me. They never listened to me, and it still remains cracked. It's been cracked for more than 200 years. Nova Scotia was in a dither over whether the colony should join the southern colonies in defiance of Britain, and rebellion flared at the Battle of Fort Cumberland in 1776 and at the Siege of St. John in 1777. Nova Scotia could have. By the end of the war, Nova Scotia outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping. British military forces based at Halifax succeeded in preventing American support for rebels in Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia basically told George Washington, take us. Here we go, take us. And Washington decided he didn't have enough money for ammunition to go into Nova Scotia, and he didn't need the port, which is a great port, Halifax, because he had Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and decided to use his resources elsewhere. While the British captured many American privateers in battles, such as the naval battle off Halifax in 1782, there were many more continued attacks on shipping and settlements until the final months of the war. Americans beat the English in Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. War is just about done. England goes back to fighting France, and the United States struggles, a fragile United States, to survive. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. The war formally ended in the Paris Hotel room, and this sounds like Guy Lombardo and Auld Lang Syne, when both sides signed the treaty pledging to forget misunderstandings and differences. And the treaty recognized the United States as a country, and both nations would be able to go up and down the Mississippi River. Benedict Arnold, hero or traitor? What do you think? Is he a hero or is he a traitor?
Traitor.
Traitor. Traitor, traitor, traitor? Well, he's a hero depending on what side of the border you're on. They honor him in New Brunswick. Well, kind of. Land was given to guys like Benedict Arnold in Nova Scotia, which splits up into New Brunswick, and in Ontario. But he's thrown out of St. John, New Brunswick, and New Brunswick by 1791. A lot of shady deals, underhanded stuff, and they basically told him and his son, get out of here, we don't want you. But he does have a statue in New Brunswick. The English controlled Nova Scotia. 1784, Loyalists fled after the American Revolution and placed in what would become New Brunswick, land taken from Nova Scotia. St. John would become Canada's first incorporated city. So, well, this also is in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The War of 1812 was a 32-month-long military conflict between the United States and Great Britain with its North American colonies and native allies. Basically, it tells you who won, who lost. Nobody won, but there were losers. It's the last conflict. No winners, no losers, except there were losers. But the victors, they write the history, and that's why present-day Canadians think they won the war. The United States gave up on its northern expansion on British soil in theory. Napoleon escapes Elba. French and English are back at each other's throats by February 26, 1815, and Andrew Jackson finds other things to do. Well, the U.S. and England are friends, maybe, or maybe not. That's Kingston, Ontario. Anybody ever been to Kingston, Ontario? Well, it's near the Thousand Islands. It's right on the Lake Ontario, and it's not very far from the American border. In fact, it's quite close. Upper Canada was firmly established as part of the British Empire. They beat the Americans. Beat because the Americans never invaded again. The Americans were done fighting with the British Empire. A win-win for both sides. Well, maybe. It was the last major confrontation between England and America, ends in 1815. Most but not all territorial disputes were settled. Canadians and American natives, Native Americans, or First Nation members, and they're basically the same people, First Nation Native Americans, saw the war as a decisive turning point in their losing struggle to govern themselves. Eventually, Canadians would go to Prince Edward Island and discuss their destiny, but not all was well. Spent one day with First Nation members up near Sudbury, Ontario, and it's called the Authentic Aborigine Experiences. They do dances and they talk about their history, and their history is pretty bad. For First Nation or Native American tribes, many of whom fought alongside the British to block American expansion, the war left a terrible legacy. With Native Americans weakened and without protection of European powers, the war set the stage for American expansionism westward in the decades to come, as well as British expansionism westward. By 1837, Nova Scotia is having buyer's remorse. Like, why didn't we go with the Americans? Why did we go? Why did we stay with the Brits? Something this is not taught in American history, but should be taught. During the rebellions of 1837 and 1838 in Upper and Lower Canada, hundreds of armed citizens rose against the government, protesting the injustices of the ruling elite and demanding changes in the politics and economics of imperial rule in British North America, the same kind of imperial rule that the southern colonists fought against. The revolt in Lower Canada was more serious and violent than the rebellion in Upper Canada. Lord Durham has to go to North America, and he has to find out why we again have this problem in North America. Well, we lost the 13 colonies, but we got Upper and Lower Canada, and we've got Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Why are we having the same type of thing that happened in the 1760s and 1770s with the southern colonies? 1838, Durham is sent to British North America to investigate the causes of the rebellion between 1837 and 38 in the Upper and Lower Canada colonies. Durham's report on the affairs of British North America led to a series of reforms and changes. These included uniting the two Canadas into a single colony, the province of Canada, in 1841. Durham proposed the creation of municipal governments in the Supreme Court in the British North American colonies, of which there are 4 now, instead of, back in the day, there were about 15, 16 back then. He also wanted to resolve the who owns land question in Prince Edward Island. His long-held plan for the union of the British North American colonies was dropped because Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were uninterested. Again, going back to Quebec, there's Wolfe, there's Montcalm, there's statues carved into the Parliament building. Durham believed that the problems in mostly French Lower Canada were ethnic in nature, not political. He found 2 nations warring in the bosom of a single state. And he was also culturally biased against French Canadians. And he also uses this phrase, which would come back the next century. He called the Quebecois people with no literature and no history. Well, when Henry Ford got the Dearborn Independent and started talking about how he hated Jews, and Jews were responsible for running the world and all that, he said that Jews were people with no literature and no history. Just took that phrase from Lord Durham. Anyway, Durham recommended assimilating them by uniting the Canadas in a way that would allow the English-speaking majority in Upper Canada to dominate. Durham's report was condemned by Upper Canada's Tory elite. Reformers in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia hailed the idea of responsible government. Now, Nova Scotia always dithered. They almost went with the southern colonists. Over time, Nova Scotia wanted to break away from England, and by 1848, Joseph Howe would lead the way. Well, do you know about the possible War of 1839? St. John, and that is in New Brunswick, St. John City Hall. Britain versus America, round 3. There was a northeast boundary dispute. This is 1839. The precise boundary line between Maine and New Brunswick remained a matter of often heated arguments for years after the close of the Revolutionary War. The dispute festered and smoldered until 1839, when it threatened to erupt into open warfare. The Maine legislature that year raised funds to support a military force of 10,000 to protect the state's border claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched to the scene from Quebec. At this point, war, we're going to war. The United States Congress entered the picture, approved $10 million, which would be $338 million today for military expenses should a war break out. Nearly 50,000 troops were ready for action, and the Major General Winford Scott was dispatched to the scene. He managed to work out a temporary arrangement between the two parties before the so-called War of Aroostook reached the point of bloodshed. They don't teach you that either, do they? The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, negotiated by the Secretary of State Daniel Webster, settled the long-time feud with England over where Maine ended and British North America, New Brunswick, or eventually Canada would begin. Another one, 5440, or fight, going up to Alaska, at the Inner Passage of Alaska. In 1818, the United States and Great Britain established a joint claim over the Oregon Territory, the region west of the Rocky Mountains, between 42 North, the northern boundary of Spain. It was Spain in those days, and then Mexico's Alta California, and 5440 North, the southern boundary of Russia's Alaska Territory. By the 1840s, the joint control had broken down. England really wasn't too interested in staying there anyway because all the fur was gone, you know, the fox fur, which they were fighting over. And the expansionist Democrats, including the 1844 presidential candidate James K. Polk, claimed the entire territory for the United States. The expansionist design was expressed by Polk's famous campaign slogan, 5440 or fight. The slogan became a rallying cry of settlers into the territory. A popular phrase picked up from Senator William Allen of Ohio, who coined the expression in an 1844 speech on the Senate floor. The dispute was settled in 1846 because America did not want to fight two wars, one against Britain in the Pacific Northwest and one against Mexico. Keep Portland weird. That's Portland, Oregon. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 partially delineated the northeastern United States-Canadian border, but left the border of the Oregon Territory unsettled. Originally, the Brits wanted to go as far as this, the Columbia River, which is down by Oregon. The United States said no, but a deal was cut. The Oregon Territory existed from August 14, 1848 until February 14, 1859, when the southwestern portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon. The region was divided up by the UK and the US in 1846. The area would include the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana, and on the other side, British Columbia and Alberta. Do you know that Windsor, Ontario is the only major Canadian city south of the United States? South. I'm on this side, Detroit, and that's Windsor, Ontario. Windsor might as well be the Detroit suburb. It's only, you go through the tunnel. And the auto industry, well, stuff goes back and forth between that area and Michigan. They are tied in. They are very well tied in, the two cities. Nova Scotia became the first colony in British North America and in the British Empire to achieve responsible government in January-February 1848, and became self-governing through the efforts of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia had representative government in 1858. This is Sault Ste. Marie. And I take it none of you have ever gone to Sault Ste. Marie, but that is Sault Ste. Marie, and that is one of the locks. There was a lot of stuff that went on there during the War of 1812 as well. Sault Ste. Marie International Bridge spans the St. Mary's River between the United States and Canada, connecting the twin cities of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. It's the 10th busiest passage crossing in the United States and Canada on the border, only land crossing for 700 miles. This is in between Montana and Alberta, and I'm going through customs, and I talked to the guy. I said, why do you bother having a fence? And he said, well, to keep the cattle from going from one side to the other side. Basically it. So how did the capital end up in Ottawa and not Kingston or Montreal or Quebec City? American considerations. Quebec City, too French. It's the walled city. It's a seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway is there. Kingston, too close to the United States. Behind me is Lake Ontario. Montreal, too French. On New Year's Eve, 1857, Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent capital of the province of Canada. Well, she really didn't know anything about it. It was somebody else, but they said, hey, Queen, you make the announcement. Make yourself feel important. It was the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who was assigned the selection process to the executive branch, or he signed the selection process to the executive branch of the government, as previous attempts to arrive at a consensus had arrived in deadlock, or ended in deadlock. The Queen's choice turned out to be the small frontier town of Ottawa for two reasons. There were more. They had to clean up the place too. There were a lot of prostitutes and gangsters and others there. Isolated location is Ottawa in the back country, surrounded by dense forest, far from the American border, about 41 miles away, and situated on a cliff would make it more defensible from attack. Ottawa is halfway between Quebec City and Toronto, and notice it's on a hill, Parliament Hill. Makes it easier to defend being on a hill. There would be other problems too, like the Pig War. The Pig War, the wording of the Ontario Treaty, Oregon Treaty, was vague when it came to the Channel Islands, which separate the continent from Vancouver Island, because there were several navigatable waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland. Ownership of the San Juan Islands remained contested. 1859, a pig wandered from the British-Canadian side to the American side and was found in the American settler's garden. Pig was shot. The British demanded compensation. American troops were sent to occupy the island while the British warships patrolled offshore. The dispute was settled in 1872. For 13 years, there was the threat of war. That's Victoria. That is Victoria. Victoria is the city known as a place for the newlywed and nearly dead. It is the place where Canadians kind of retire because it has probably the best climate year-round in Canada, and a lot of the newlyweds go there. It's a beautiful city, absolute beautiful city. Canada becomes a country in 1867, biggest trade partner of the U.S. I was up in Canada for the 150th anniversary of its birth. The reasons for a nation, well, a lot of it, American. Political deadlock resulting from the current political structure. Demographic pressure, population expansion. Economic nationalism and the promise of economic development. An intercolony railroad, which would eventually extend out to the west in British Columbia. That's why British Columbia is part of Canada, not the United States, because they got a promise that there would be a railroad coming out to British Columbia, which would improve trade, military movement, and transportation in general. Cancellation of the Canadian Reciprocity Treaty, a free trade policy whereby products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs. Wait a minute, this is 1854, I'm talking about tariffs. 1854. Anything changed? Starting in 1854, which was then considered to be beneficial for Canada in 1865 by the United States, partly as revenge against Great Britain for the unofficial support of the South in the American Civil War. Nova Scotia sent troops, or Nova Scotians volunteered to become soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War. The possible threat of invasion from the U.S., Canadians had fended off American invasions during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, increased by the Alaska Purchase of 1867, which was supported on the floor of the U.S. Senate by Charles Sumner, among others, precisely in terms of taking over the remainder of British North America, or North America from the British. Prince Edward Island, if you sail into, and for until 1998, you had to sail into Prince Edward Island, and it's beautiful, as you can see, that rocks at the bottom there. There's me in front of Confederate Hall. 1864 is a big year, time to form a country. In 1864, 23 representatives from the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI meet in Charlottetown to discuss the formation of a country. It's the beginning of the discussions that would lead to the eventual formation of Canada, July 1st, 1867. I'm totally confused. This is John Hamilton Gray meeting John Hamilton Gray. I have no idea who John Hamilton Gray is, except they're both John Hamilton Gray. So I don't know. In September 1864, Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference, which was first meeting in the process leading to the Quebec Resolution to the creation of Canada in 1867. And they met here. That's the Independence Hall equivalent in Canada. It's called the Confederation Hall. Prince Edward Island did not, even though they're hosting this, they did not find the terms of the Union favorable and balked at joining in 1867, choosing to remain a colony of the United Kingdom, but might have been a little more than the United Kingdom. In the late 1860s, the colony examined various options, including the possibility of becoming a discrete dominion unto itself, they had no population, as well as entertaining delegations from the United States who were interested in Prince Edward Island joining the United States. They tried in 1868. They met with the Ulysses S. Grant administration, where Britain said, "You're a colony, don't do it." That could have been a flare-up. And they were talking again around 1871, 1872 about joining the United States, but Canada, the Prime Minister MacDonald said, "We got to take care of it." Because their feeling was, if PEI went to the United States, it would only be a matter of time before Nova Scotia and New Brunswick become members of the United States. Canada formed 3 months after the purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the U.S., so Great Britain didn't get it. Russia needed the $7.2 million at 2 cents an acre at the time, $153 million today, 42 cents an acre today. After, we're talking about something else that's around in 2025. Crimea, Ukraine, Crimean War debts, which lasted from 1853 to 56, the northern colonists began seeking their own country in 1839. And this is where Canada starts, Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. Canada entered World War I in 1914 when England got involved. Canada entered World War II in 1939 when England got involved. 1931, Canada achieved nearly total independence from the United Kingdom. It was more like the United Kingdom said, get lost, get out of here. All to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, go, go, we don't want you. And Canada said, no, we don't want to break ties with the Crown. It took them 51 years to break ties with the Crown, from the Statute of Westminster in 1931 to the Canada Act of 1982, and basically that was it. We separated, although we still like the Queen, we separated for the most part. Yeah, we do some ceremony where we open Parliament, and yeah, we do say something, hi King Charles III. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy, with King Charles III being head of state. The country is officially bilingual at the federal level. It's French in Quebec and bilingual in New Brunswick, French and English. And Queen Elizabeth was well liked. You go through Canada and you find statues of Queen Elizabeth here, there, and everywhere. This one is in St. John, Newfoundland. July 1st is a national holiday, but in Quebec, St. John Baptiste Day seems to be a bigger holiday. It takes place on June 24th of each year. Finally, Canada, the 51st state, and Mark Carney and Trump. Canadians in 1793, well, not Canadians, they were Brits, but a guy by the name of John Simcoe was appointed the leader of what is now Ontario, and he hated the Americans. Absolutely hated the Americans. He was a soldier, and one of the first things he did was move the capital of Upper Canada from Niagara Falls in Niagara-on-the-Lake to inland, to get away from the Americans' threats to what is now Toronto. Canadians like being Canadians. Canada is a socialist country. And if you took all the provinces, British Columbia is more aligned with Washington and Oregon. Alberta is more aligned with Texas because of oil. Saskatchewan, I'm not sure. That was a back road. In fact, I knew a guy from there, Arch MacArthur, who told me that they did not have paved roads in Saskatchewan until 1958. Manitoba has a lot of money. Winnipeg. Ontario is conservative, at least they have a conservative head. But they might not, the Canadian conservatism might not be the same as American conservatism. Quebec, whoever throws them the most money. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, well, they're more in line with Maine. Lobster fishermen and all that. So you got to look at the political divisions. They're not coming in as one state. You're not coming in with 40 million people as one state in a place as diverse as that. You also got the Northwest Territories. Yukon, I've been in Yukon. A lot of snow there. And none of it, and very few people live in none of it. So it would be difficult to annex Canada, very difficult. In 2025, the United States President Trump called for the annexation of Canada, with Canada becoming the 51st state. Then he announced what was the equivalent of economic warfare. There would be a steep tariff. Canadians have boycotted everything American, including travel to the States. If you look at tourism to, say, Las Vegas, way down, way down. Of course, that also has to deal with Mexico. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said Canada was not for sale. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn to talk about the War of 1812 and its impact.